actually have a couple of reps, and then we have UW-Madison through Skype. So, Northeast Wisconsin Technical College, Lawrence, St. Norbert's, UW-Oshkosh, and then again Madison through Skype. I know some of you were here last time, but I do have school profiles if you would like to see one. And then I have like a sample of a current transcript with the other side being kind of what we're hoping to go towards, or those pieces that we're hoping to incorporate on future transcripts.
Sure.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Do you have one of these too?
Yes.
It's the same.
Does that help you? I can see. Yep. So I guess, any questions right off the bat regarding SBL standards for our panel? It's just gonna be kind of a Q&A time for you.
Do any of you want us to start off discussing it as admissions, how you look at schools and what you look for exactly, what that process looks like?
I can go, because ours is fairly straightforward initially. So at NWTC, the technical college, most of our programs require, we look at grade point first. We have what we call multiple measures. Grade point first. Most of our programs require 2.6 grade point average. A number of our health science programs require a 3.0. So we look at that first. If students don't meet that, we look at the ACT scores, and we break them down reading, writing, math. And if the students fit the requirements for either grade point average or ACT scores, they're in the program. If they don't match that, then they can take what's called the AccuPlacer placement test, which is one of the ones more commonly used with technical colleges. The one thing that to be mindful of is some of our programs will have pre-program requirements. Some of the health science, like nursing, you may have to have a B or better in chemistry, or C or better in chemistry rather, maybe physics, depending on the math, science requirements. So that's where the letter grade would come into play, and I have been assured by our admissions people, because I am a career coach, I'm not an admissions person, but our admissions administrators have said they will, rest assured your students will be able to figure that out and work on the grading system to incorporate it into what we currently have.
I can go next. At Lawrence University, we don't require a certain GPA, and we have seen quite a few of these transcripts already, just because there's actually 2 states in the United States that don't do letter grades anyways, New York and Texas, I believe. And what we look for too is a strong essay, a strong teacher recommendation, and in a small school like Chilton, that would be huge. Knowing that, the student worked 4 days a week, or 4 days of the weekend at the Calumet County Fair, so that they, they have that little bit of piece of information that they can add to that application. So we went test optional over 10 years ago, so we don't require an ACT or SAT, but a lot of students submit them. So we just look at the whole application, and like I said, the things that I mentioned is what we look for.
I'm Ellie, I'm an admission counselor at St. Norbert, and I'm going to echo a lot of the things that have already been said. We really look at the applicant holistically. As an admission counselor, I really get to know most of my applicants actually personally, and I can kind of tell their story once I hear it from them. But one of the first things we're looking at is their choice in classes and really seeing what they did over their 4 years. So I haven't had a chance to look at this too closely yet, but the kind of idea of what you're looking at is going to really break down what they've done. And then we're looking at, yes, what they did as far as a GPA, we're looking at their ACT or SAT scores. Personal statement and letters of recommendation are huge. So we're really getting to know the person as a whole entire student, and they also have a lot of opportunities to kind of tell me more about where their GPA came from and what they were able to do. And it definitely, extracurricular activities are so important in seeing involvement outside of the classroom. Students doing things that they don't have to do but that they choose to do, working a job, playing a sport, or being in a play or musical or singing, and all that stuff is important to us when we're evaluating a student, for sure.
Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Gudlinski. I'm Director of Admissions at UW Oshkosh. When we're looking at applications, the first thing that we look at is the courses that the student completes, because what we're looking for initially is the 17 required units that we have that are required within the admission for the UW system schools. So 4 English units, which they need 4 in order to graduate from high school anyway. 3 math units with the highest being at least Algebra 2. 3 science units, 3 social science units, and then 4 additional units, which can be additional English, math, science, social science, foreign language, computer science. Those courses fall into that. So that's the first thing we're looking at. If the student meets those unit requirements, then we're taking a look at the entire picture. So it's a comprehensive review of the student's work, their extracurriculars. If we get a letter of reference, Oshkosh does not require a letter of reference, but if we get that, that will play into that as well. The student statement on the application, a chance for the student to talk about themselves and who they are and what they can bring to our university. So as we're looking at this, the GPA, the grades are only one factor in that comprehensive review. We do require the ACT or SAT scores to come in. So we're looking at that. We're looking at the courses that a student is taking. Are they challenging themselves? Are they doing honors? Are they doing AP? Do you have Laude courses here as well? So that would be those upper level, type courses, a little bit more challenging courses. So we're looking at those sorts of things. We're looking at grade pattern. Did the student start out strong, but we get the transcript after the junior year and those grades have fallen off each year. What's going on there? What can we look at? What can we perhaps reach out to the student and ask questions of? So looking at the grades themselves is just one factor in all of these other things that we're taking into consideration. So I'm glad to see that a GPA is still included, and that it's on a 4.0 scale. Is that correct? Because that does help, not necessarily for the admission part of things, but as students are applying for scholarships, scholarship applications may have a specific GPA requirement. So having the GPA on that transcript is going to be very helpful for that next step in the process. And then I'll hand over to
Mr.
Matt.
Swenson?
Excellent. Hi guys, my name is Mark Swenson. I really appreciate the staff here at Chilton offering this virtual way for us to connect. So very excited to be here. And yeah, I definitely want to echo what many of my colleagues have shared already. We do utilize a holistic review process, and I know a lot of people might get the impression that at a place like Madison, where we do have some competitive numbers, that we have formulas and minimums, and that truly is not the case. We holistically review every single one of our students, utilizing a lot of the factors that have already been discussed here, really starting with that academic record. What are those students taking, and what is available to them in their school? How are they performing in those courses? And beyond that, layering in the different factors such as extracurricular involvement, the essays, we do have a required letter of recommendation that we ask comes from an academic source. So that can always be a great opportunity for us to get the context about what a student is like in the classroom. But beyond that, thinking more kind of about that academic record, just a little bit of background about our admissions counselors. We are very well trained in understanding the context in which a student is being educated, and that's really important to us because we are never comparing students. Say we're never comparing a student from Chilton to say a student at Notre Dame Academy or something like that. We're looking at a student as an individual within the context of their school. And as we go about reviewing these students, we're typically reviewing them in a school group. So we're going through and reading students that are coming from Chilton High School. Okay, and that's why having a school profile, especially one that articulates well, the SBL or whatever the grading scale might be, is really helpful for us, because that puts our counselors in kind of that mindset for what these students are doing in the context of their school. Okay, so that is really something I just wanted to kind of hammer home there, because we will never disadvantage a student based on the environment in which they were educated. We know that there might be different academic course offerings, there may be different grading scales, and we're just going to do our best to make sure that we understand that context before moving forward, looking at that record, and then starting to layer in all those other pieces of our holistic review as we go to make our final decision as we build that greater class.
I think what really helps is this school profile that will be coming with the transcript. As we receive these, if we get a transcript that looks different from other transcripts, having the school profile, having that information there to help give us an explanation of how that grading scale is determined, that really does help give us that additional information that we do need.
Do you receive GPAs that are not on a 4.0 scale?
Yes. Yeah, there are some schools that are on a 5 scale, there's schools that are on a 12-point scale, there's schools that are on 100-point scales. So, again, having that school profile, we can understand right away where their grading is.
Some schools have weighted grades, some schools have unweighted grades. That's another really big reason why you can't just compare two students from different schools, like apples to apples.
How do each of your schools look at class rank?
At Oshkosh, this year we stopped looking at class rank. What we have found is that there are more and more schools that are going away from it. So it's becoming less of a factor for us, and we've made the determination that the GPA is more indicative of how a student is going to do once they get to our university.
Kind of similar, we'll record it if it's on the transcript, we'll record it. I mostly honestly just use that to make students aware of certain scholarships that they might be eligible for, but we don't actually use it for anything in our evaluation process because so many schools don't have it on their transcripts anymore.
Us as well, we record it, but it plays a small factor.
And I know
Go
Go ahead.
Yeah, that'd be the same for UW-Madison. If it's provided, we'll absolutely utilize it within our review, but it's by no means a requirement, nor is it preferred in any situation, so.
I think for us, we're probably unique because it's more regional, but I do know the director of our admissions has been talking to Fox Valley Tech, and again, he said, rest assured that we will develop a system, and so students will not be left behind because of this. And like I said, he's already talked to Fox Valley Tech. I think Brian, I don't know, you had somebody here last week maybe from Fox Valley Tech? Brian?
Mary Hansen.
Okay, so, in terms of the technical college, we'll be looking at grade point averages, but if we need to do any conversion, we'll be doing that. But somebody did mention the scholarships, and that is something to be aware of. Depending on where your students are looking for scholarships, there might be some other criteria that they'll just want to be able to show they're worthy of the scholarships.
And those scholarships, for the most part, we have no control over the criteria for those scholarships because in a lot of cases, they're private donors, and they control what that criteria is to be eligible for that scholarship. So just something to watch for as you are looking for those things.
If you have community organizations that offer scholarships, I'm not sure if you've communicated with them, but that would probably be something you want to bring to them.
A lot of our scholarships for Chilton High School students do not require
the class rank. And it's even been a discussion amongst the staff that if there is a specific scholarship that a student is applying for, and it's asking for a class rank, we can provide it upon request from them. But it's not something that we are going to be publishing on their transcripts. So if they need it, we can help them with it, but otherwise, from what we've done, the looking that we've done with the scholarships that I post on my website, they're not requesting class rank. So.
And from the perspective of a private school where we have a lot of merit-based scholarship programs, we don't use class rank as one of the necessary parameters for that at all. And we also will, if a GPA isn't weighted, we may adjust it, we might kind of adjust it ourselves so it does kind of scale up on a 4-point scale, because like we've been saying, other people have said, there's some schools that do 100-point scales and different things like that anyway, so we're used to having to kind of figure out how we can make it work for our system.
I have a question about the total number of students that you can physically admit into your schools. So you talked about how, like Mark had mentioned, looking at Chilton students, you're looking at them together as a group, and say you do that for all the different schools you receive applications for, and you decide, yes, I want to admit this student, I want to admit this student. Do you get to a point where it's like, wow, I'm admitting more than what I can physically take on? Then how do I decide which students do I truly admit, and which ones of that group, sorry, I can't admit you? How do you make that decision?
I would hand this one over to Mark, since they're a school that would limit the number of students.
Yeah, and I can definitely contextualize that. So just to kind of be clear, we don't have quotas per school. There absolutely are school groups, perhaps in Wisconsin, where you may receive, only a handful of it, and elsewhere. This is not just in Wisconsin by any means, but we may admit an entire school group, where we might admit every single student that we see from there. So that's possible. That's all I'm saying. We don't have a max cap based on the institution in which we can take students from. However, when we see, when we're coming from a school, we kind of understand what kind of those upper echelon students look like. The most competitive students is how I would characterize that. So when we kind of see what students are the most competitive, they're really taking that challenging coursework across subject areas. They're doing well, performing in the classroom, and we see a lot of those strengths in other areas. That kind of gives us a sense of, again, who are the strongest students from this school? And when we're understanding that, we're utilizing the school profile to kind of to help us with that. And then we do see some of the students that we think could perhaps do the work at UW-Madison, and then we see some strengths from, but perhaps are not among the most competitive. And that is difficult year to year, because, unfortunately, as a competitive, institution, we don't have space for all the students we would love to have join us on campus. So that is where we have to have those more difficult decisions. I mean, that's our job as counselors, to find what students are the best fit, and that is not easy all the time. It's really hard, and that's when we really rely on a holistic review process. We're going to be starting with the academics, but we're looking for those other things, those compelling factors. What are these students doing outside of the classroom? Do they have unique backgrounds? Unique skill sets that would really serve to support our community of Wisconsin. And so those are a lot of the factors that we look at when we're really kind of trying to differentiate and see what students are the strongest and those that we want to bring on to our class. So hopefully that provides a little bit more context. Sorry if I went down a little bit of a tunnel there, but.
What I'm wondering about is, like, if you have so many students you want to admit, but as you said, it's a competitive university and you're looking at a lot of strong students, you get to a point where I can't admit all of them. And you had mentioned earlier, like when you're comparing Chilton students, you're looking at them and choosing which ones of those, and you're not comparing them to some, another student in another school. My question is, when you reach that point though, where say you have 10 applicants from Chilton and you say, okay, 5 of them I want to admit, and other schools you're saying, this number, but you're getting to a point where with your freshman class, you can only admit so many. So you've reached that, I have too many, how do I go back and look at everyone I want to take in, and who do I choose to exclude from that group?
Right. Yeah,
then
absolutely.
Are you beginning to compare a student from Chilton to a student from some other school?
Right. And that's where, and this is kind of a very bigger conversation too, but this is when, I'm kind of speaking from a UW-Madison perspective, and I know our colleagues probably share similar practices, but that's when we really get into kind of the nitty-gritty of enrollment management. And this is where we utilize some of our, the different pieces of our application review process. So, we have an early action period and a regular decision period. Some of those students who apply with us early action, we may defer them, meaning we're not going to give them a final decision right away. This is one way where we see a student that perhaps might not be the most competitive, but maybe a student that could be successful at UW-Madison, and we perhaps want to see those mid-year grades. That is one way in which we can kind of see, is the student going to show us that they can do the work in this rigorous senior year, for instance. Perhaps if they do really well and we see that we do have space, we may revisit that student when we have another set of eyes. At least 2 other reviewers will go and look at that student again, and then they will make their recommendations on whether we want to bring them onto the class. So there are multiple review processes in place where we go, and if we are really coming down to space issues, we will look at institutional areas of need. Do we need to bring in more students from the state of Wisconsin? Are we looking to grow certain students coming from Calumet County because of something that our chancellor told us, for instance? Those are some of the factors that come into play, and they vary year to year. So that is kind of difficult to predict. So it can kind of change year to year how we put the finishing touches on that class. And another one, and kind of a piece in which we're at right now, is we're looking at possibly going to our wait list, which is where we have some students there. If we really do need to bring on those final students to help fill our class, we'll individually review them yet again to bring them on. And this is true for all students across our different residency pools. So again, forgive me if I'm kind of dancing around your answer there, but I hope that kind of provides some context.
Well, and even though Oshkosh is a UW system school, like Madison, our admission process is different. We have rolling admission. So as applications become complete, we are making those decisions and getting those decisions out to students. Where with Madison, it's more of that bulk review and the decisions go out then at that time. So it's a little bit different. I've worked at Oshkosh for 18 years. We've closed admissions for freshmen once in those 18 years, and that was for 3 days. And then we reopened it. So we're not getting to the point where we have to close the doors because we don't have enough residence hall space or anything like that. That's never been an issue. Because we usually have extra space because one of our residence halls is used for a conference center, so we can always go into that space if we have higher classes that are coming in.
If you all were to have 20 students from Chilton High School with 4.0 grade point averages, what's the best way that you would look to differentiate who those upper echelon students are? How can they distinguish themselves from their peers?
I was just gonna say, the first thing I would look at is what classes they took, and I think that's the number one way that students do distinguish themselves from their peers, and teachers do a really good job of noticing, and counselors noticing what students need to be challenged more in certain areas and how they can get to AP chemistry or something like that. That's not a class that every high school student should necessarily take, but that's the kind of thing that really sets students apart. I think a lot of times involvement is a really good thing. We're looking at, the standardized testing scores. That's another way that students can set themselves apart. But I would say mostly it's class selection by far is the biggest factor when it comes to looking at a GPA and comparing it to someone else's GPA.
I would agree with that. I mentioned our 17 units. Those are a minimum requirement.
Yeah, that's good.
And if we need to compare 2 students from the same school, we're looking at how much beyond that minimum requirement are they doing. And especially going into that senior year. A lot of students, as they make their schedule for their senior year, they're looking at, okay, what do I need to graduate and then move on? But what we're looking at is for students to continually challenge themselves through the senior year. Because I guess the best way to put it is, you play sports. Okay, you play basketball. You take a year off of playing basketball. You come to the coach the next year and say, I'm ready to start. Well, no, you haven't prepared yourself for that. You have to maintain that preparation as you're going through. And sometimes as a parent, I know it's a difficult conversation to have, but if if your child is looking to go on to an institution of higher learning, it is in their best interest to continue to challenge themselves with those courses. If your school offers college-level courses, if they are ready to take them, then by all means, take a college-level course, if they are ready to take them. Because the drawback to that is the start of their college career. So they're earning a grade in a course, and that grade stays with them, because they have to report that they took that college-level course, and we're gonna require a transcript. So that plays into it as well.
One thing I think that we look at too is the fit, if the student is the right fit, and hopefully our counselors will get to know the student well enough that, can they see themselves here on this campus, and are they gonna have everything they need to succeed, and, so I think apples to apples, if, all 20 students would, it would be definitely the fit and the feel if the student felt that they could see themselves there for the next 4 years or 5 years.
For us, it depends on program requirements. If they meet the grade point average or ACT scores, there may be pre-program requirements. And then it's a date of the application, if it's a waitlisted program. So the technical college system is a little bit different in that regard, but there are waitlists.
A question for Lynette and for Ellie. You both made comments where it made me think that a student who's applying to your university actually maybe has an interview or sits down with somebody face to face. Is that correct?
We do have optional admission counselor interviews, but we also, for students that aren't able to make it to campus, it's actually part of the program that I do is we do alumni-based interviews across the United States, across countries, where the student matches up with an alum and sits down at Starbucks and talks to an alum, and then we take that alum's feedback and provide it to the admissions counselors. But our interviews are optional but encouraged.
Yeah, we call them recommended interviews. We also utilize those for that. We have an early admission program that requires an interview, and then after that it becomes highly recommended. You can pretty much guarantee that if a student comes to visit St. Norbert, I'm not going to let them leave without talking to them. That's usually what we do for the interviews, and usually we include parents in that, not the early admission one, that's a one-on-one interview. But later on, it's typically including the parents, and it's also a really good time for them to kind of interview me to a certain extent too, ask the questions they have about the school. But that's also a time when I'm asking them, what are the classes you're taking that are challenging you? What are the classes you're taking that you're really strong in? A lot of times I get the opportunity to have those interviews too when someone's a junior, when a lot of students kind of start to visit colleges. And then I can even become part of the conversation of what classes are you planning on taking next year? Do you want me to consult you in that class selection? And that's where I really encourage students to if they feel confident and, like you said, ready to take a college course or an AP course, and their teachers and their counselor are also encouraging them to do that, that's when I really encourage that type of step to be taken too. And that really starts the process of me getting to know that applicant.
In order to be respectful of their time and grateful for them coming down. If there's anything else you want to ask yet, otherwise the student panel is ready and we'll move down to the other classroom.
I just have one quick question. So with standard-based learning, they're allowed to retake. So do you think as admission counselors that based on all of the things they submit, you would be able to determine the student who got the grade point average, not ever having to retake, taking the same classes as the student who has the same grade point average, but they had to retake things several times to get to that. So do you think you'd be able to pick up on that?
Probably not, because all we're seeing is the end result. My daughter went to Fond du Lac High School, which has standards-based grading, and she retook tests. But I had the discussion with her that when she gets to college, that's not going to happen. So I think it's having that conversation, and it comes from home, it comes from the counselor, that this next step in the process is different than what you're used to right now. Is retaking a good thing, a bad thing? I don't know. My daughter, yes, she retook tests, but she is also a really good student aside from that, and she's in college now and has a 3.8 GPA in her junior year. So, maybe it helped her, I don't know, you know, so.
I think one of the concerns we as parents have is some of us with high achieving students who get that score right away, boom, they're there. So another student works really hard, would typically be a B student, reassesses regularly, and they end up with a very similar GPA as my student. How does someone at UW-Madison looking at their transcripts know that difference between them? Like, that's my concern, so, and that's something we're having discussions with here
Yeah, and
internally.
all we're seeing is the end result,
Correct.
because we're getting the transcript, and that's what has the end result.
I think the one other differentiation is typically a student who does not have test anxiety would perform well on their ACTs and SATs, probably better than that typical B student. So I mean, that, to me, in my mind, that's one way to differentiate as well, but you can have a really strong student who just has really bad test anxiety when it comes to ACTs and SATs, so doesn't work for a student like that.
I think that standards-based learning does take a step towards taking test anxiety more out of the equation, because test anxiety shouldn't be the number one academic predictor used by any means. One thing that I would say is, would I be able to tell if you know, in History 9, one student got an A on the first try and another student took 4 or 5 tries to get an A? No. But when I look at a whole transcript, I'm going to be able to tell what student got the A right away and what student might have had to struggle along and get there eventually, because that student's going to take AP and college credit history courses maybe in their junior and senior years, while that other student, the teacher's not going to keep pushing them into those courses, because that's not a good way for that person to learn either. So in the holistic view of a 4-year education, I think you can tell those two students apart. Personally, I think I can. Bring it on, I guess. Call me. When is your student going to be a senior applying to take over?
Well, and you know, the thing too is, I mean, it's different for us, but testing is one component of learning, and students continue to grow and flourish and mature, and someone who struggled in high school could flourish in college. But from the admittance standpoint, yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. That's a tough one.
I do understand where you're coming from, but I just
Yeah.
think 4 years of work is going to pull that out of that student. That student is going to become the president of a group as well, and they're going to do a lot of other things that distinguish themselves, I would say. Not to get too wordy.
They have a lot more free time because they're not restudying for hours.
Seriously, that's when they're getting involved in other things.
Employability skills.
Yep.
Scholarship attractive.
This is a really good thing to see too, where it has the cross-curricular skills, bottom left corner. That's a really, I would definitely look at that. I wish all transcripts had something like that on them.
Okay, alrighty, and thank you